Welcome to Horror Camp. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. I remember the day we arrived at Whispering Pines like it was etched into my mind with fire. There were 6 of us. Me, Max, Chris, Emily, Tyler, and Sarah. We were young, carefree, and hungry for adventure, the kind you can't find in the crowded corners of city life. The trip had been Tyler's idea. He said he'd heard about Whispering Pines from a friend, someone who swore it was the perfect camping spot. If he wanted isolation, no cell signal, no noise, just the serene quiet of nature. That sounded like paradise to us. We piled out of the SUV, laughing and stretching after the long drive. Max had the handheld camera, and he was already filming, narrating our arrival like we were the stars of some indie travel documentary. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," he announced, panning the camera over the towering trees and the narrow dirt path leading into the woods. "Population, 6 brave souls." The place was beautiful in a wild, untouched way. The trees stretched high into the sky, their thick branches intertwining to form a canopy that let only streaks of sunlight through. The air smelled fresh, tinged with pine and damp earth. It was quiet. Too quiet, now that I think about it. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the faint crunch of our boots on the gravel as we unloaded our gear. Emily was the first to notice the carvings. She called us over to one of the trees near the edge of the trail, pointing to the strange symbols etched into the bark. They weren't initials or hearts like you'd expect from hikers marking their presence. These were intricate patterns, circles, lines, and what looked like runes. Emily traced one of the symbols with her finger, her brow furrowed. "What do you think this means?" she asked. "Probably some local kids messing around," Max said, aiming the camera at the tree. "Or maybe it's the ancient language of tree people. We should totally leave a message back." I tried to laugh, but something about the symbols unsettled me. They didn't look like the kind of things someone would carve for fun. They looked deliberate. Ritualistic, even. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to kill the mood. We were here to have fun, after all. That's when we met the ranger. He came out of nowhere, stepping onto the trail with the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if he'd been watching you for a while. He was tall and wiry, his face weathered from years spent outdoors. His uniform was faded, the green fabric almost blending into the forest around him. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, sharp, piercing, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, regret, whatever it was, it made me uneasy. "You kids camping here?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Yes, sir," Tyler said, stepping forward like the unofficial leader of our group. "We heard this is the best spot around." The ranger nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to each of us in turn. "It's a good place, all right. But you need to be careful out here. Stay near the campgrounds. Don't wander too far into the woods." "We not?" Emily asked, her curiosity piqued. The ranger hesitated, glancing at the tree with the carvings. "People wander too far in these woods, and they don't come back," he said finally. His tone was flat, like he was stating a fact rather than issuing a warning. Max, of course, couldn't resist making a joke. "What, like Bigfoot gets them or something?" The ranger didn't smile. "There are stories," he said, his voice low. "Legends about this place. Most folks around here stay away from Whispering Pines. They say the forest takes people." "Takes people?" Sarah echoed, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "What does that even mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tipped his hat and started walking back down the trail. "Just stick to the campgrounds," he said over his shoulder. "And if you hear anything, ignore it." We stood there in silence for a moment, watching him disappear into the trees. His warning lingered in the air like smoke, and for a second I considered suggesting we find another campsite. But then Tyler clapped his hands, breaking the tension. "Come on, guys, it's just a story to scare tourists. Let's get set up before it gets dark." Everyone else seemed eager to move on, but I couldn't shake the ranger's words. "If you hear anything, ignore it." What did he mean by that? And why did he look at the carvings like they were more than just scratches on a tree? As we hiked deeper into the woods, the unease I'd felt since spotting those carvings grew stronger. The path narrowed, the trees closing in around us, and the air seemed to grow heavier. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the ranger's warning had gotten under my skin, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we finally reached the clearing that would be our campsite, the tension eased a little. It was a nice spot, with plenty of room for our tents and a clear view of the lake just a short walk away. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in shades of orange and gold. Max turned the camera on me, grinning. "So, fearless leader, what do you think of Whispering Pines?" I forced a smile and gave a thumbs up. "Perfect place for a weekend getaway," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. But as I looked past the camera at the darkening woods, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd made a mistake coming here. If only I'd known then what I know now. If only I'd listened to the unease creeping in, the warning in the ranger's eyes. But it was too late. We were already part of the story, one we wouldn't all live to tell. The afternoon air was warm but carried an odd stillness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. After the long hike to the clearing, we dropped our gear and took a moment to breathe in the fresh, pine-scented air. Chris and Max were already unrolling the tents, arguing over which poles went where. It was classic Max. He always acted like he knew what he was doing, even when he clearly didn't. Chris, ever the patient one, sighed and took over while Max decided to supervise. Emily and Sarah had wandered off to check out the lake, their laughter echoing faintly through the trees. The lake was one of the main reasons we'd chosen this spot. Tyler had said it was pristine, almost untouched. I stayed behind with Tyler, who was busy unpacking our supplies, while I focused on documenting everything with the handheld camera. It was the perfect opportunity to capture some candid moments, the kind of memories we could laugh about years later. I panned the camera over the clearing, capturing Chris kneeling by the half-assembled tent, his face a mask of concentration. Max, standing nearby, was pretending to give orders like some kind of self-appointed camp director. No, the pole goes in the other loop. Come on, man, this isn't rocket science, he said, his tone dripping with mock authority. Chris didn't even look up. Maybe if you helped instead of standing there like an idiot, we'd be done by now. Guys, I'm getting all of this, I said with a grin, zooming in on Max's expression as he rolled his eyes. Future generations will marvel at your teamwork. Max pointed at the camera. Future generations will see that I was the brains of this operation. Sure they will, Chris muttered, shaking his head. I turned the camera toward the tree line where Emily and Sarah had disappeared and zoomed in as far as I could. The lake was just barely visible through the dense foliage, a glimmer of sunlight reflecting off the water. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Idyllic even. Then I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, a faint rustling sound, soft and barely audible. But as I listened closer, it didn't sound like rustling at all. It sounded like whispering, low and indistinct, like voices just out of earshot. I pulled the camera away from my face and looked around, but there was no one there. Chris and Max were still bickering over the tents, and Tyler was busy sorting through the food supplies. The sound seemed to be coming from the woods, but when I focused on the trees, I saw nothing. Did you guys hear that? I asked, my voice louder than I intended. Chris glanced up from the tent. Hear what? Urisp, I said, trailing off as the sound faded. It was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the silence of the forest. Max laughed. Oh no, don't tell me you're already spooked. We just got here. Maybe the trees are talking to him, Chris added, smirking. Very funny, I said, but my unease lingered. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind blowing through the branches or my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went back to filming, focusing on the little details. The way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the patterns of shadows on the ground, the way the trees swayed ever so slightly despite the lack of any real breeze. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something unsettling about it, too. The silence was too perfect, too heavy. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Eventually, Emily and Sarah returned from the lake, their arms full of smooth stones they'd collected from the shoreline. Emily dumped her collection on the ground near the fire pit we'd cleared, beaming with pride. "We're making art," she declared. Sarah nodded, holding up a particularly flat, round stone. "We're thinking rock towers, very zen." "Good luck with that," Max said, finally snapping the last tent pole into place. "Meanwhile, we've been doing the real work." "Real work?" Emily shot back, raising an eyebrow. "From what I saw, Chris did all the work while you just stood around." Chris snorted. "Thank you." I kept the camera rolling, catching the playful banter as Tyler joined in, pretending to take Max's side. It was moments like these that made the trip feel worth it. The easy camaraderie, the laughter, the sense that we were untouchable, far away from the stresses of the real world. But then, as I adjusted the focus on the camera, I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like several, overlapping and speaking in hushed tones. I froze, the camera still pointed at the group, and strained to make out the words. They were just on the edge of understanding, slipping away every time I tried to grasp them. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, noticing the change in my expression. I hesitated, lowering the camera. Nothing." I thought I heard something again. "Probably the wind," Tyler said, tossing a bag of chips onto the pile of supplies. "This place plays tricks on you if you're not used to it." "Yeah, the wind," I said, though I wasn't convinced. I forced a smile and went back to filming, but the unease gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, watching us, whispering things we weren't meant to hear. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows grew longer, stretching across the clearing like dark fingers. We finished setting up camp just as the first stars began to appear, and the temperature dropped enough for us to appreciate the warmth of the fire we built. The others seemed to have forgotten about the strange carvings, the ranger's warning, and my whispering voices. But I hadn't. Every time I looked at the camera's playback, I half expected to see something lurking in the background. A shadow, a face, something that didn't belong. That night, as we sat around the fire, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at the dark forest beyond. It felt closer now, like the trees had inched forward, their branches reaching out. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to our trip. It was watching, waiting, and I had a feeling we'd given it exactly what it wanted. 6 unsuspecting visitors who didn't know what they were walking into. The fire crackled softly as the 6 of us gathered around, the orange glow casting flickering shadows on our faces. It was one of those moments that felt almost cinematic, like we were part of a scene we'd look back on with nostalgia. The tents were pitched, the supplies were organized, and the day's hike had left us tired but satisfied. Above us, the night sky was clear, with stars scattered like tiny diamonds. The silence of the forest felt heavier now, wrapping around us like a thick blanket, broken only by the occasional pop of the firewood. Max leaned forward, a mischievous glint in his eyes. He always loved being the center of attention, and campfires were his stage. "All right, people," he said, rubbing his hands together. "It's time for a proper ghost story. And lucky for you, I've got just the one." "Here we go," Emily muttered, rolling her eyes but smiling all the same. She was busy poking at the fire with a stick, sending up tiny sparks. No, this one's good," Max insisted, raising a hand like he was swearing an oath. "It's about this very place, Whispering Pines." That got everyone's attention. Tyler leaned back, his face half lit by the firelight, while Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Even Chris, who usually rolled his eyes at Max's antics, tilted his head in curiosity. "All right, storyteller," I said, pointing the camera at him. "You've got the floor." Max grinned, clearly enjoying himself. He adjusted his posture, leaning closer to the fire so the shadows on his face deepened, making him look more dramatic. "So, here's the deal. Whispering Pines isn't just your average camping spot. There's a reason it's so remote, why so few people know about it. The locals, at least the ones who haven't moved away, say this place is cursed." "Oh, come on," Chris said, but his voice had a nervous edge. "Cursed? Really?" "Let him finish," Emily said, shushing him. Max nodded in appreciation. "Thank you, Emily. Anyway, the story goes that a long time ago, like way back in the 1800s, there was a small settlement near here. Loggers and their families, mostly. They lived off the land, chopping down trees, building homes. Everything was fine until people started going missing." "Missing how?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. "No one knows," Max replied, lowering his tone as if he were sharing a forbidden secret. "One day, someone would just disappear. A hunter heading into the woods, a child wandering too far from home. They'd look for them, of course. Whole search parties would go out, but they never found anything. No bodies, no tracks, just gone. And then the whispers start." "The whisperers?" I asked, zooming in on Max's face with the camera. Max nodded solemnly. "That's what the survivors called them. They'd hear voices, faint and far away, coming from the trees. At first they thought it was the missing people calling for help, but when they followed the sounds, they'd find nothing, just trees. Some said the whispers were trying to lure them deeper into the forest. Others thought it was the spirits of the missing, warning them to stay away. Either way, the settlement didn't last much longer. One by one, the families packed up and left. The forest took the rest. The group was silent for a moment, the only sound the crackling fire. Even Chris seemed uneasy now, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I kept the camera rolling, capturing the way the firelight danced in Max's eyes as he leaned back, satisfied with his storytelling. "That's creepy," Emily admitted, finally breaking the silence. She tossed her stick into the fire, watching as the flames consumed it. "But it's just a story, right?" Max shrugged. "Maybe. But there are still reports of people going missing around here. Hikers, campers, even a couple of rangers. And you know what the weirdest part is? Some of them were carrying recording equipment, cameras, audio gear. But none of the footage ever explained what happened. Just hours of static, or worse." "Wes?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max smirked. "I'm just saying maybe the forest doesn't like being recorded, so good luck with your little documentary, buddy," he added, glancing at me. "Great," I said, lowering the camera. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." Everyone laughed nervously, but the tension hung in the air like smoke. The fire seemed smaller now, the shadows around us darker. I felt the unease creeping back, the same feeling I'd had when I first heard the whispers. That's when we heard it. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. A rustling sound, soft and distant, coming from the woods behind us. Then came the snap of a branch, sharp and unmistakable. We all froze, our eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Chris said, his voice low. He grabbed the flashlight he'd left by his feet and pointed it toward the trees, the beam cutting through the dark like a knife. It illuminated nothing but more trees, their trunks pale and ghostly in the light. "Probably just an animal," Tyler said, trying to sound casual but failing. "A deer or something." "Yeah, sure," Sarah said, her voice tight. "A deer that just happens to be sneaking around after we finish a ghost story?" Max laughed, but it was forced. "Come on, guys. You're letting the story get to you." But I wasn't so sure. As I scanned the woods, I thought I saw movement. A flicker of something just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was too quick to make out, gone almost as soon as I noticed it. My heart was pounding now, and I gripped the camera tighter, wishing I'd stopped filming earlier. "We should call it a night," Emily said, standing and brushing dirt off her jeans. "This is freaking me out." No one argued. We put out the fire quickly, scattering the embers and making sure it wouldn't spread. The forest seemed to press in on us as we worked, the darkness feeling heavier with every passing moment. Even Max was quiet now, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy he tried to hide. As we zipped ourselves into our tents, I couldn't help but replay the sound in my head, the snap of the branch, the faint rustling. It wasn't just an animal, I was sure of it. Something was out there, watching us, and for the first time I wondered if the ranger's warning had been more than just a story. "If you hear anything, ignore it." Lying there in the dark, the words echoed in my mind. I didn't sleep much that night. None of us did. It started just after midnight. At first I thought it was part of a dream. Muffled sounds and shadows flickering at the edge of consciousness. But then I heard it. Emily screaming, her voice cutting through the stillness of the night like a knife. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I was disoriented, my heart pounding in my chest. The inside of my tent was pitch black, the air colder than I remembered. There seemed to be help. Someone's out there. Emily's voice came again, panicked and loud. I scrambled to unzip my tent, fumbling with the zipper in my rush. As soon as I stepped out, the cold night air hit me like a wall, and I realized how eerily quiet it was. No wind, no insects. Just Emily's ragged breathing and the soft rustling of everyone else crawling out of their tents. "What happened?" I asked, hurrying over to Emily's tent. She was standing just outside it, her face pale and her hands shaking. She pointed at the zipper, which was halfway undone. "It opened on its own," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I swear, I zipped it all the way up before I went to sleep. I heard it, the zipper, it just started moving." Chris was already on alert, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the campsite. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said, but his tone didn't sound convinced. "A raccoon?" Emily shot back, her voice rising. "Raccoons don't unzip tents. Something, or someone, did this." Max emerged from his tent, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "What's going on? Why is everyone yelling?" "Emily says her tent unzipped itself," I said, glancing nervously toward the tree line. The fire had died down hours ago, and without its light the woods looked impossibly dark, the shadows impenetrable. "Okay, let's not freak out," Tyler said, stepping forward and trying to sound calm. "Chris, check around with the flashlight. Maybe it was an animal, or the wind. Tents aren't exactly high security, you know." Chris nodded and began walking around the campsite, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I noticed the way his shoulders were tense, how his movements were slower than usual, like he didn't really want to find anything. "What's that?" Sarah's voice came from behind me, soft but sharp. She was pointing at the ground near Emily's tent. We all crowded around, and that's when we saw them. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft dirt just a few feet from the tent. They weren't large, maybe the size of a child's feet, but the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. "Those weren't there earlier," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could have been one of us," Max offered, though even he didn't sound convinced. "The one was walking around barefoot," Sarah said firmly. "And look." She pointed at the direction the footprints seemed to lead. They started near Emily's tent and then disappeared abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Chris shone the flashlight toward the trees again, his movements more urgent now. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly. "Is someone out there?" Silence. The beam of the flashlight danced across the trunks of the trees, but nothing moved, nothing responded. "Okay," Tyler said, clapping his hands together. Let's just calm down. There's a logical explanation for this. Is there? Emily asked, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Because I'd love to hear it. Tyler hesitated, glancing at the footprints again. Maybe it's just the forest playing tricks on us. Weird light, shadows, that kind of thing. Shadows don't unzip tents, Emily snapped. Max tried to lighten the mood, though it was clear he was nervous too. All right, Emily, if it's the Whispering Pines ghost, I'm sure they're just here for a good time. Maybe they want to join our campfire stories. No one laughed. We stood there for a while, staring at the footprints, the woods, each other. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves far off in the distance. I could feel the weight of the forest around us, pressing in, the darkness deeper than it had been before. Let's just get back to bed, Chris finally said, lowering the flashlight. We'll deal with this in the morning. Deal with what? Emily asked, her voice rising again. We don't even know what this is. Exactly, Chris said, his tone firm. We don't know, so there's no point in freaking ourselves out over nothing. Everyone just stay in your tents, zip them up tight, and keep your flashlights close, all right? No one looked particularly reassured, but we didn't have much of a choice. One by one, we returned to our tents, though I noticed that everyone lingered a little longer than usual before zipping themselves in. I sat in mine for a while, clutching the camera and listening. Every small sound outside made my heart race. The twig snapping, the soft rustle of leaves. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, the footprints, the unzipped tent, Emily's pale face as she pointed at the zipper. None of it made sense. I wanted to believe Chris, to tell myself it was just an animal or the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet, and that silence felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting for something. Eventually I laid down, still fully dressed, my flashlight within arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the footprints again. Imagined them leading straight into my tent. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because I drifted off. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the unease. My dreams were restless, filled with shadowy figures and the sound of zippers sliding open in the dark. That night the cold seemed to seep into my bones, a chill that no sleeping bag could ward off, and though we all tried to laugh it off in the morning, none of us would ever forget how the forest felt that night, how it seemed to breathe, to reach out and touch us in ways we couldn't explain. The next morning, the unease from the night lingered like a fog over our camp. None of us had slept well, and it showed. Emily had dark circles under her eyes. Sarah was unusually quiet, and even Max, normally the first to crack a joke, seemed subdued as he stirred the last embers of the fire back to life. Breakfast was a rushed affair, with more nervous glances exchanged than actual conversation. But now it was clear. Red-faced Dolan had already stopped to talk. "All right," Chris said, finally breaking the silence. He was leaning against one of the trees, arms crossed. "We need to figure out what's going on here. Last night wasn't normal." "No kidding," Emily muttered, glaring at the zipper of her tent as though it might betray her again. "I think we should look around," Tyler suggested, his voice hesitant. "You know, see if there's anything unusual. Maybe there's an explanation for what's been happening." "And what if there isn't?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyler didn't have an answer, and neither did the rest of us. We packed light, just a couple of flashlights, a water bottle, and the handheld camera, which I kept firmly in my grip. There was some debate about whether we should all go or leave someone behind to watch the camp, but in the end, no one wanted to be alone. We set off together, heading deeper into the woods along a narrow trail that looked less like a path and more like something nature had reluctantly allowed us to walk on. The forest felt different that morning. The light was soft, filtering through the canopy above in golden streaks, but it didn't feel warm. It felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, making every step harder. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. "I don't like this," Emily said after a while, her voice cutting through the quiet. She was walking close to me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're not the only one," Max said from behind us. "This place gives me the creeps." "Since when do you get creeped out?" I asked, glancing back at him. "Since last night," he admitted, kicking at a rock. "Something's not right here. You can feel it, can't you?" I didn't answer, but I knew he was right. It wasn't long before we found the first of the carvings. Emily spotted it, just like she had the day before. This one was etched into the trunk of a large pine tree, its bark weathered and rough. The symbol was different from the one we'd seen near the camp, more intricate, with overlapping lines that spiraled inward like a "Is this look older to you?" Emily asked, tracing the carving with her finger. "It looks like something out of a horror movie," Sarah said, keeping her distance. I aimed the camera at the carving, zooming in to capture the details. There was something unsettling about it, though I couldn't put my finger on why. It felt deliberate, like whoever had made it had done so with purpose, not just for decoration or vandalism. "Guys, over here," Chris called out, his voice tight. We followed him to another tree, then another. Each one had a carving, all different but with the same eerie precision. Some were high up as though whoever made them had climbed the trees, while others were near the ground. "What do you think they mean?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. "Nothing good," Max muttered, running a hand through his hair. We pressed on, the tension mounting with every step. The forest seemed denser now, the trees closer together, their branches weaving into a canopy so thick it was like walking through twilight. The air was cooler, too, and the faint scent of something metallic hung in the breeze. That's when we found the campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing, barely visible through the undergrowth. At first I thought it might be a hunter's camp, but as we got closer, it became clear that no one had been there for a long time. The tents were still standing, but just barely. One had collapsed, its fabric torn and frayed, while the other leaned precariously to one side, its poles bent. Gear was scattered everywhere. Backpacks, sleeping bags, pots and pans. All left as though whoever owned them had fled in a hurry. "This isn't normal," Chris said, stepping cautiously into the clearing. "No kidding," Max said, kicking at an overturned cooking pot. I kept the camera rolling, panning slowly across the scene. There was something about the abandoned camp that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just that it was empty. It was the way everything seemed frozen in time, like the people who had been here had vanished in the middle of whatever they were doing. "Look at this," Emily said, kneeling by one of the backpacks. She unzipped it and pulled out a notebook, its cover damp and worn. "What is it?" I asked, moving closer. "A journal, I think," she said, flipping through the pages. Most of them were illegible, the ink smudged and faded, but a few sentences stood out. "The whispers are getting louder. I can't sleep anymore. I think they're watching us." Emily stopped reading, her hands trembling slightly. "What the hell does that mean?" "Nothing good," Sarah repeated, her voice shaking. Chris picked up a flashlight from the ground, testing its switch. It flickered weakly but didn't stay on. "This stuff isn't that old," he said. "It couldn't have been here for more than a year or two." "Then, where are they?" Max asked. "The people who left all this?" No one answered. We spent a few more minutes searching the campsite, but the unease was becoming unbearable. Every now and then I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Let's go," Tyler said finally, his voice tight. "We've seen enough." No one argued. As we made our way back to our own camp, the forest seemed darker, the silence heavier. The carvings on the trees felt like eyes, watching us as we passed. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the whispers the writer had mentioned. Were they the same whispers I'd heard? And if so, what did that mean for us? Deep down, I think we all knew the answer, but none of us were ready to say it out loud. Not yet. The forest seemed to change the further we went, as though it didn't want us there. The trees grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted like ancient guardians. The light barely filtered through the canopy, casting everything in muted greens and grays. The air felt heavier, colder, carrying a dampness that clung to my skin. It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones, making you feel like you'd never be warm again. "Gerbils Mausro," We hadn't planned to go so deep into the woods, but the abandoned campsite had left us with more questions than answers. Something about the journal Emily found, with its cryptic warnings and half-faded entries, had compelled us to keep going. Maybe we were hoping to find some kind of explanation, something that would make everything make sense. Or maybe we were just too stubborn to turn back. We needed to find out. I don't know how long we walked before we saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, half hidden behind the trees. It could have been another trick of the light, another shadow that didn't belong. But as we got closer, the shape solidified, revealing itself to be a building, or what was left of one. It was an old cabin, its wood weathered and gray with age. The roof sagged in places, and one of the windows was broken, its jagged edges like the teeth of a snarl. Vines crawled up the sides, their tendrils wrapping around the structure like they were trying to pull it into the ground. The front door was intact, but barely. Its surface was scarred with deep scratches, like someone, or something, had tried to claw its way inside. "What the hell is this doing out here?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking the silence. She was standing a few feet behind me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Maybe it belonged to one of those loggers Max was talking about," Emily said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Loggers don't carve weird symbols into trees and abandon their camps," Chris muttered, stepping closer to the cabin. Max snorted. "Well, they clearly didn't have Yelp back then. 0 stars for this place." "Odd time, Max," Emily said, shooting him a glare. Chris reached the door first, testing the handle. It didn't budge. "Locked," he said, stepping back. "Of course it's locked. Let's just leave it," Sarah said quickly. "We don't need to go inside." "Are you kidding?" Max said, grinning. "We didn't come all this way to turn around now. Come on, Chris, kick it down." Chris hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. But if I break my foot, you're carrying me back to camp." He raised his leg and kicked the door hard, the sound echoing through the forest like a gunshot. It didn't give way at first, but on the second kick, the wood splintered and the door swung inward with a groan. The air inside the cabin was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside, the light from our flashlights cutting through the gloom. It was a single room, with a small rusted stove in one corner and a table that looked like it might collapse if you so much as breathed on it. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it recent, judging by the bright spray paint, but most of it older, scratched into the wood with knives or nails. And then there was the journal. It was sitting on the table, its leather cover cracked and worn. Emily was the first to approach it, her flashlight illuminating the dust that swirled in the air around it. She picked it up gingerly, like it might crumble in her hands. "Another journal," she said, flipping it open. "What does it say?" Tyler asked, standing close behind her. She skimmed the first few pages, her brow furrowing. "It's disturbing. It talks about hearing voices in the woods, about feeling like they were being watched. Whoever wrote this thought the forest was alive, that it was hunting them." "Great," Max muttered, leaning against the wall. "Just what we need. More creepy forest ghost stories." "It's not a story," Emily snapped, flipping to another page. "Listen to this. The trees are speaking to me now. I can hear them at night whispering things I can't understand. I've tried to leave, but the forest won't let me. The paths change, the trees close in. It wants me to stay." A chill ran down my spine. "Please tell me it gets less horrifying." Emily shook her head. "The last entry says, 'The forest claims us all.' And that's it." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint creaking of the cabin, as though it was breathing along with us. Then I noticed it. On the far side of the room, partially obscured by a pile of debris, was a camera. It was old. Not as old as the cabin, but definitely not new. A dusty, outdated model with a long strap and a lens that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. "Guys," I said, pointing toward it. Chris was the first to follow my gaze. He picked up the camera carefully, turning it over in his hands. "It's still recording," he said, frowning. "What?" Emily asked, stepping closer. Chris hit the playback button and the tiny screen flickered to life. At first there was nothing but static, the kind that made my stomach twist with dread. But then the screen cleared and I could see the inside of the cabin. It was the same room we were standing in, but something about it was wrong. The light was dimmer, and the walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, crawling along the floor and ceiling, and then there were the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the static, but as the footage played, they grew louder, overlapping, a chaotic symphony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "I swear one of them said my name." "Turn it off," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Chris did, but the whispers didn't stop. A ruse, safe. "I still hear them," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Everyone looked at me, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. "Hear what?" Tyler asked. "The whispers," I said, glancing around the room. "You don't hear them?" They all shook their heads. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. No one argued. As we stepped out of the cabin, the forest seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper, and though no one else admitted it, I knew they felt it too. That the forest wasn't just alive, it was watching, and it wasn't done with us yet. That night was colder than the previous one, and the air carried a heaviness that none of us could quite shake. Dinner had been subdued, quiet bites of canned soup and crackers shared around a fire that seemed weaker than before. Nobody mentioned the cabin or the journal, but it was there in the unspoken tension, lingering like a shadow over the group. Even Max, usually the loudest voice among us, seemed preoccupied, staring into the flames with an uncharacteristic seriousness. Afterward, as the fire burned down to embers, we all retreated to our tents. I lay awake for what felt like hours, the events of the day looping in my mind. The journal, with its disturbing entries, kept resurfacing in my thoughts. The forest claims us all. Those words felt like they were carved into my memory now, as clear and permanent as the symbols etched into the trees. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but it couldn't have been long before I was startled awake by shouting. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. Max's voice, loud and angry, cutting through the stillness of the night. Emily, what the hell did you do with it? I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, fumbling for my flashlight. The beam of light wobbled as I unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold night air. Around me, the others were doing the same, their flashlights adding to the chaotic glow. Max was standing near the fire pit, his face flushed with anger, while Emily stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. "What's going on?" Chris asked, stepping between them. "The journal's gone," Max said, his voice tight. "I left it in my tent before I went to sleep, and now it's gone." Emily scoffed. "And you think I took it? Why would I do that?" "I don't know," Max shot back. "You seemed pretty interested in it earlier. Maybe you wanted to read it again. Or..." "Haha." "Or what?" Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "You think I'm playing some kind of prank? I didn't touch your stupid journal." The rest of us stood there awkwardly, caught in the middle of their argument. The firelight flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across their faces. I could feel the tension thickening, like the air itself was closing in on us. "Okay, let's just calm down," Chris said, holding up his hands. "It's probably still in your tent, Max. Did you check under your stuff?" "Yes, I checked," Max snapped. "It's not there. Someone took it." "Maybe it wasn't one of us," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. Everyone turned to look at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Max asked, narrowing his eyes. Sarah hesitated, her gaze shifting to the dark woods beyond the campsite. "I mean, what if it's still in the cabin? What if we didn't bring it back?" "I remember bringing it back," Emily said firmly. "I put it in Max's tent myself." "Well, it's not there now," Max said. "So unless the forest grew legs and walked off with it." "Maybe it did," Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling. "After everything that's happened, can we really say that's impossible?" The group fell silent. The idea was ridiculous, of course, But then again, so were disappearing footprints, unzipped tents, and whispering voices. And yet, here we were. That's insane, Max said finally, shaking his head. But he didn't sound as confident as usual. Maybe, Chris said, but Sarah's right about one thing. We don't know what's going on here. Pointing fingers isn't going to help. Let's just take a breath, okay? Max didn't respond, but he dropped his arms and stepped back from Emily. She, in turn, turned away and sat down near the dying fire, her knees pulled up to her chest. I don't know why, but I kept the camera rolling. Maybe I thought it would help us figure out what was going on later, or maybe I just felt like I needed to document everything. Either way, I found myself stepping back and hitting record, framing the scene in the flickering light of the fire. The group began to settle, but the tension lingered, unspoken but palpable. I could see it in the way Emily refused to look at Max, the way Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, and the way Max paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. Even Chris, usually the voice of reason, looked uneasy. "Do you guys feel that?" Sarah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Feel what?" Chris asked, his voice wary. "Hicks. Colder," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. Like it dropped 10 degrees in the last few minutes. I hadn't noticed it at first, but she was right. The air was colder now, sharp and biting, and the fire, though still burning, seemed to give off less heat. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. "Great," Max muttered. As if this place wasn't creepy enough. "I think we should check the tents," Emily said, standing up, "just in case. Maybe it got moved somehow." Nobody wanted to argue with that, so we split up, each of us checking a different tent. I started with mine, carefully unzipping it and shining my flashlight inside. My sleeping bag and gear were just as I'd left them, and there was no sign of the journal. I stepped back out, shaking my head. "Nothing," I called out. "Same here," Tyler said from his tent. One by one, everyone reported the same thing. The journal was gone. Completely gone. "Okay," Chris said, taking a deep breath. "Let's think this through. If it's not in any of the tents, and it's not by the fire pit, then it's gone," Sarah interrupted, her voice shaking, "just like everything else." Nobody responded, but the silence was answer enough. We all felt it, that creeping sense of dread, the growing certainty that the forest itself was against us. I glanced at the camera's playback screen, hoping to see something, anything that might explain what was happening. But all I saw was the group, huddled together in the firelight, their faces pale and drawn. I thought back to the journal, to its warnings about the forest and its whispers. "The forest claims us all." The words echoed in my mind, sending a chill down my spine. I didn't know what the forest wanted, but I was starting to think Sarah might be right. It wanted us to turn on each other. It wanted us afraid, fractured, and vulnerable, and if we weren't careful, it was going to get exactly what it wanted. That night, as we crawled back into our tents, the camp felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, the silence heavier, and though no one said it, I think we all knew we weren't alone. The next morning, the tension was suffocating. None of us could shake the eerie events of the night before. The missing journal was still the elephant in the room, a ghost hovering over us as we huddled around the fire eating a half-hearted breakfast of granola bars and stale crackers. The mood was heavy, and even Max, who usually had a joke for everything, was uncharacteristically quiet. "We need to find that journal," Chris said finally, breaking the silence. "If it's out here, we'll find it. Maybe it'll give us some answers. Or maybe it'll lead to more questions," Emily muttered, hugging her knees to her chest. "Either way," Chris replied, his tone firm. "We need to try. Sitting here isn't going to help." With no better plan, we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods, retracing our steps from the day before. The forest felt different in the daylight, but not in a comforting way. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, deeper, as if they were waiting for us to step into them. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above us, but the sound wasn't soothing. It was unsettling, almost like a whisper that followed us wherever we went. We spread out slightly, moving in pairs to cover more ground. I stayed close to Emily, who was scanning the forest floor with a focused intensity, her flashlight slicing through the gloom. Every now and then she'd stop and point at something, a broken twig, a strange rock, but it was never the journal. It was Sarah who found the totem. "Oh, guys," she called out, her voice tinged with nervousness. "You might want to see this." We all converged on her location, and there it was. A strange object hanging from one of the trees. It was suspended by what looked like strips of old leather, its form twisted and grotesque. The base was made of twigs, tied together in a crude angular shape. Bones, small ones, maybe from a bird or a small animal, were fastened to the structure, dangling like macabre ornaments. Feathers and bits of fur were woven into it, adding to its unsettling appearance. "The leaf? What the hell is that?" Max asked, his voice low. "Some kind of totem?" Chris said, stepping closer to inspect it. "Don't touch it," Emily said sharply, her voice cracking slightly. Chris froze, his hand halfway to the totem. He pulled it back reluctantly, glancing at Emily. "You think it's cursed or something?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "But it's not normal. It shouldn't be here." Lifted the camera, zooming in on the totem. Even through the lens, it made my skin crawl. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that felt ancient and angry. I couldn't explain it, but looking at it too long made me feel like I was being watched. "We should leave it alone," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't ours to mess with." "For once, I agree with Sarah," Max said, taking a step back. "Let's just keep moving." We turned to continue the search, but as I swung the camera around, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement in the distance. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The camera's lens had picked up something. A shadow, darting between the trees, just at the edge of visibility. "Wait," I said, lowering the camera slightly. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Chris asked, stopping in his tracks. "Something moved," I said, pointing in the direction of the shadow. "Over there." The group turned to look, their flashlights sweeping across the trees. The forest was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves overhead. But I knew what I had seen, or at least I thought I did. A figure, humanoid but indistinct, moving too quickly for me to make out any details. "Probably just an animal," Mac said, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," I said firmly. "It wasn't an animal. It was bigger." "Bigger how?" Emily asked, her voice tense. "Like a person," I said, though the word felt wrong as soon as I said it. It had moved like a person, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. "All right, let's not jump to conclusions," Chris said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light." "Then why do you look like you believe him?" Emily asked, her eyes narrowing. Chris didn't answer. Instead, he shone his flashlight in the direction I had pointed, the beam cutting through the shadows. It illuminated nothing but trees, their trunks pale and lifeless in the light. "See?" Max said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Nothing there." I wasn't so sure. My hands tightened on the camera as I kept it trained on the spot where I'd seen the movement. The playback would prove I wasn't imagining things. At least, I hoped it would. "We should keep moving," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Standing here isn't going to help." Reluctantly, we agreed, but the atmosphere had changed. The tension that had been simmering before was now a full boil, and every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant creak of branches, felt amplified, like the forest was alive and listening to us. As we moved deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow again, but there was nothing. The others must have felt it too, though no one said anything. We were all walking faster now, our flashlights darting nervously from tree to tree. Then I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps behind us, just out of sync with our own. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, stopping in my tracks. The group halted, their flashlights snapping toward me. "Hear what?" Chris asked, his voice low. "Footsteps," I said. "Behind us." We stood there in silence, listening. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing. Then, faint and distant, came the unmistakable crunch of leaves. "Who's there?" Chris called out, his flashlight aimed into the darkness. No response. "Let's just go," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Please." We didn't argue. We picked up the pace, almost running now, our footsteps hurried and chaotic. I kept the camera rolling, unable to stop myself, even as my heart pounded in my chest. When we finally made it back to camp, we were breathless and on edge. The totem and the shadowy figure had left us shaken, and though no one said it, I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. We weren't alone out there. That night, as we huddled around the fire, the forest felt closer than ever, its darkness pressing in on us. And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't help but feel like the shadow was still out there, watching. The morning didn't come with the usual relief that daylight brings. Instead, it came with dread. When I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I immediately knew something was wrong. The fire pit, which we'd extinguished the night before, was cold and dead, as expected. But the camp itself felt off. The others were already awake, their faces pale and drawn, and a heavy silence hung over us like a storm cloud. It was Emily who spoke first. "Where's the food?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. She was standing near the supplies, or rather, where the supplies should have been. The backpacks that had contained our food, water, and other essentials were scattered, their contents missing. All of them. Every last item. "What do you mean? Where's the food?" Max asked, walking over. "It's in the packs, isn't it?" "No, it's not," Emily snapped, her voice rising. "It's gone. Everything is gone." We all gathered around, staring at the empty backpacks as though looking hard enough would make the food and water reappear. But it didn't. The granola bars, the cans of soup, the bottles of water, all of it had vanished without a trace. Even the emergency stash we'd buried near the fire pit was gone. This doesn't make sense," Chris said, shaking his head. "We packed enough food for 3 days. Who the hell takes everything and leaves the backpacks?" "It had to be an animal," Tyler suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe a bear or something?" "Bears don't unzip backpacks and take bottled water," Emily shot back, glaring at him. "Then who?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Who would do this?" Max raised his hands, trying to calm everyone down. "All right, let's not freak out yet. Maybe we just misplaced some of it." "Misplaced?" Emily hissed. "How do you misplace every single piece of food and water?" "I don't know," Max snapped, his usual bravado cracking. "But standing here yelling isn't going to help, is it?" The group fell silent, but the tension was palpable. I could feel it, like an electric charge in the air. I kept the camera rolling, documenting the scene, the empty backpacks, the panicked faces of my friends, the growing sense of despair. It was a habit at this point, a way to distance myself from what was happening. If I was behind the camera, I could pretend I was just an observer, not a participant. "We need to figure out what to do," Chris said finally. "We can't stay here without supplies. We need to leave." Great, Sarah said, throwing up her hands. And go where, exactly? Do you even remember which way we came in? Because I don't. She was right. The trail we'd followed into the campsite was barely visible now, swallowed by the forest. The trees all looked the same, their trunks blending into an endless, monotonous pattern that made it impossible to tell one direction from another. Okay, everyone, just take a deep breath, Max said, though his own breathing was uneven. We'll find the trail. We just need to stay calm and stick together. We packed what little we had left, mostly just the camera, flashlights, and the few pieces of gear that hadn't been disturbed, and set off in what we thought was the right direction. The forest was silent as we walked, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned us. It wasn't long before we realized something was wrong. The trail, which should have led us back toward the ranger station, seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. We'd walk for 10-15 minutes, only to find ourselves back where we started, staring at the same cluster of trees or the same moss-covered rock. It was like the forest was rearranging itself, trapping us in a loop. "This can't be happening," Emily said, her voice breaking. She stopped walking and turned to face us, her eyes wide with fear. "We've already passed this tree. I know we have." "You don't know that," Max said, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. "Yes, I do," Emily insisted, pointing at a mark on the tree, a small, jagged scar in the bark. "I noticed it earlier. We're going in circles." Chris exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's stop for a second. We need to think this through." "What's there to think about?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "We're lost. The forest is messing with us, and you all know it." "No one's messing with us," Max said, though he avoided looking at her. "We're just tired, okay? We'll find the way out." "Will we?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Because I don't think we will. I think we're stuck here." "Stop," Chris said, his tone sharp. "This isn't helping. We need to keep moving." I stayed quiet, keeping the camera trained on the group. Through the lens, they looked different. Smaller, more fragile. The forest loomed behind them, vast and unyielding, its shadows stretching like claws. We tried again, picking another direction and walking for what felt like hours. But no matter how far we went, we always ended up back at the same spot. The same tree, the same rock, the same twisted branches overhead. It was maddening. "This is impossible," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the forest doesn't want us to leave." "Don't say that," Max snapped, his hands clenched into fists. "It's just a forest. It's not alive." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it. None of us did. By midday, exhaustion had set in. We were hungry, thirsty, and desperate. The group was falling apart, the tension from the morning boiling over into arguments and accusations. Emily blamed Max for suggesting the trip in the first place. Max blamed Sarah for being negative. Chris tried to mediate, but even he was fraying at the edges. Through it all, I kept filming. Part of me felt guilty, like I was exploiting the situation, but another part of me couldn't stop. I needed to capture it, to have proof of what was happening, in case we never made it out. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in shades of orange and gold, the reality of our situation sank in. We were trapped, with no food, no water, and no way out. The forest had us, and it wasn't letting go. That night, as we huddled around a weak fire, the silence was unbearable. No one spoke, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at me. The forest had taken our supplies, our sense of direction, and now it felt like it was taking something else. Our hope, our sanity. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I thought I saw something move. A shadow, darting between the trees, watching. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was a predator, and we were its prey. It happened the morning after we realized we were trapped. None of us had slept well, or at all, really. The night had been filled with the rustling of unseen things in the woods, sounds that seemed too deliberate to be animals. Every snap of a branch or crunch of leaves had sent us into a frenzy of flashlight beams and whispered debates about whether we should stay awake in shifts. By the time the pale gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, we were all running on fumes. Tyler was the one who suggested checking the perimeter. He was trying to be proactive, I think, trying to do something, anything, that made him feel like he had control. If we just get a better sense of where we are, maybe we'll figure out how to get out of here, he'd said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. He grabbed his camera, slung it over his shoulder, and promised he wouldn't go far. Stay within shouting distance, Chris had warned. Tyler nodded, gave a reassuring wave, and disappeared into the trees. At first, none of us were worried. Tyler had always been the adventurous one, the guy who thrived in the outdoors. He knew how to navigate, how to keep calm under pressure. If anyone could find something useful out here, it was him. But then an hour passed, and then another. "Where the hell is he?" Emily muttered, pacing near the remnants of our fire. Her voice was tight with frustration, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Chris tried to stay calm, but even he was starting to fray at the edges. Maybe he got turned around. This place is a maze. "Wouldn't just get lost," Sarah said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Not Tyler." Max tried to play it cool, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed. "Maybe he's messing with us. You know how he is. He loves a good prank." But no one laughed. We all knew Tyler wouldn't joke about something like this. Not here. Not now. By the time the sun was high overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor, Panic had set in. We called his name until our voices were hoarse, our shouts swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. We split into pairs to search, but every path we took seemed to twist back on itself, leading us in endless circles. It was Emily who found the camera. She spotted it near the edge of the lake, lying half buried in the mud. The sight of it made my stomach drop. Tyler would never just leave his camera behind. It was practically glued to his hand. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Is it on?" Chris asked as Emily picked it up, her hands shaking. "I think so," she said, brushing off the dirt. The screen was cracked, but the device still seemed functional. She hit the playback button, and we all crowded around, the tension in the air so thick it was hard to breathe. The footage started innocently enough. Tyler was walking through the forest, narrating his thoughts in that casual, confident way of his. "All right," he said, his voice tinny through the speakers. "Just doing a quick sweep. Let's see if there's anything useful out here." The camera panned over trees, rocks, the occasional patch of moss. At one point, he stopped to examine a strange symbol carved into a tree, muttering something about how it looked familiar. But as the footage continued, his tone began to change. The confidence wavered, replaced by uncertainty. "Okay, this is weird," he said. The camera jerked around as he turned, scanning the forest. "I swear I just passed this tree. Am I going in circles?" The screen flickered, static creeping in at the edges. "Hello?" Tyler's voice was sharper now, louder. "Is someone there?" The camera panned again, and for a split second I thought I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, too fast to make out. Tyler must have seen it too, because he froze. The camera zoomed in on the spot where the shadow had disappeared, the lens shaking slightly. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. "This isn't funny." The static grew louder, crackling like distant thunder. The camera jerked wildly as Tyler started moving, his breathing audible now, quick and shallow. "I'm heading back," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "This place is messed up." The footage became harder to watch. The screen flickered more frequently, and the shadows seemed to stretch and warp, like the forest itself was shifting. Tyler's breathing grew louder, more ragged, and then he stopped again. "Oh God," he whispered. The camera tilted down, revealing footprints in the mud. Bare footprints, too small to belong to him. They led away from the lake, deeper into the woods. For a moment, Tyler didn't move. The camera stayed trained on the footprints, the static rising and falling like a heartbeat. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the static, but they grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, as though a dozen voices were speaking at once. The language was incomprehensible, guttural and strange, but it sounded wrong, like it wasn't meant for human ears. "What the hell?" Tyler's voice was barely audible over the noise. The camera spun around as he looked for the source of the whispers, the lens catching glimpses of movement, shadows darting between the trees, too quick to be real. And then the faces appeared. They were brief, almost too brief to process, flickering in and out of the static like a twisted slideshow. Distorted faces, pale and hollow-eyed, their mouths open in silent screams. They filled the screen, one after another, each more horrifying than the last. The whispers reached a crescendo, a deafening cacophony that made my skin crawl. Tyler was running now, the camera bouncing wildly as he sprinted through the woods. His breathing was loud, panicked, and then the footage cut out. The screen went black, and the silence that followed was suffocating. None of us spoke, too stunned to process what we had just seen. What was that? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Something took him, Emily said, her eyes wide with fear. Something's out there. Max shook his head, his face pale. No, it's fake. It has to be fake. It's not fake, Chris said quietly. You saw the same thing I did. You need to leave, I said, my voice shaking. We need to get out of here, now. But as I looked around at the dense, unyielding forest, I realized the truth. We didn't know how to leave. The forest had us, and Tyler was gone. And deep down I knew he wasn't coming back. The forest felt different now. It wasn't just the oppressive silence or the eerie stillness that had been unsettling us since we arrived. No, this was something else. It felt alive, as though the trees themselves were watching us, leaning closer, conspiring. I don't know when exactly it started. Maybe it had been happening all along and we'd only just begun to notice. But the forest wasn't behaving like a forest anymore. It felt like a maze, one designed to keep us lost. We had spent the morning combing through every inch of the campsite, hoping to find some clue that could help us understand what had happened to Tyler, or at least a way to leave. But every search turned up empty, and the more time passed, the more the forest seemed to shift around us. It doesn't make any sense, Chris said, his voice tight with frustration as we stood in a small clearing, the canopy above blotting out most of the daylight. We've been walking in a straight line. I've been marking the trees, for God's sake. We should have made it out of this section by now. Maybe you didn't mark them as well as you thought, Max said, though his usual sarcasm was absent. He was trying to stay calm, but his hands were trembling. Chris pointed at a tree nearby, where a fresh, sharp slash had been carved into the bark. That's my mark. We've passed this spot 3 times now. How do you explain that? Nobody had an answer. It's the forest, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It's messing with us. Don't start, Max snapped, running a hand through his hair. It's not the forest. It's just, we're disoriented, that's all. It's easy to get turned around out here. Then how do you explain that? Emily cut in, pointing to a tree a few feet away. We all turned to look, and my stomach dropped. It was another symbol, carved deep into the bark. This one was different from the others we'd seen, more intricate, with spirals and jagged lines that seemed to twist and turn into each other. The sight of it made my skin crawl. "He wasn't there before," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I'm sure of it." "It must have been," Max said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We just didn't notice it." "How could we not notice that?" Sarah demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "It's huge." I raised the camera, zooming in on the symbol. Even through the lens, it looked wrong, like it didn't belong. There was something almost deliberate about it, like it was a message or a warning. "This place is playing tricks on us," Chris said, his jaw clenched. "We need to keep moving. Standing around isn't going to help." But moving didn't help either. No matter which direction we took, the forest seemed to fold in on itself, twisting the paths into loops that always brought us back to the same clearing. The symbols became more frequent, appearing on trees that we could have sworn had been bare minutes earlier. Some of them were small, subtle carvings that could have been missed if you weren't looking for them. Others were larger, more elaborate, spanning entire sections of bark with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. "You hear that?" Emily asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" Chris asked, turning to her. "Listen," she said, holding up a hand. We all went silent, straining to hear whatever she was talking about. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the wind. But then it came neuralously as the sound of a murmur of voices. It was faint, blending into the background noise of the forest, but it was there, and it was getting louder. "Why do you think this affair undertaken for peace is lawful?" I asked, looking at Maggie. The whispers, they were back, and this time, they didn't sound distant. They sounded close, too close. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "Now." "Which way?" Max shot back, his voice cracking. "Every path leads us back to the same damn place." "Anywhere but here," Emily yelled, already moving. We followed her, breaking into a run. The forest blurred around us, trees rushing past as we sprinted blindly through the maze. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, coming from every direction. They weren't just sounds, they were words, though I couldn't understand them. It was like they were speaking a language that wasn't meant for human ears. The symbols continued to appear, etched into the trees we passed, their shapes more intricate and twisted the further we went. I kept the camera rolling, the lens shaking with each step, capturing the madness of it all. Part of me wanted to stop and examine them, to try and make sense of what they meant. But the fear driving me forward was stronger than my curiosity. "Wait, stop!" Chris shouted, skidding to a halt. We nearly crashed into him, our momentum carrying us forward. He was staring ahead, his flashlight aimed at the ground. The path we'd been following simply ended. There was no gradual fade into undergrowth, no sign that it had ever continued. It just stopped, as though the forest itself had decided it didn't want us going any further. "This can't be happening," Max muttered, his voice barely audible. "This isn't real. It's not real." "It's real," Emily said, her voice trembling. "And it's not going to let us leave." "No," Chris said firmly, turning back to face us. "We're not giving up. We just need to—" A loud crack cut him off, echoing through the forest like a gunshot. It was followed by a sound I'll never forget. The unmistakable noise of something heavy crashing through the underbrush, moving fast. Too fast. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Emily's arm. "I don't know," Chris said, his voice tight. "But we need to keep moving." We turned and ran again, the whispers chasing us, growing louder with each step. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees twisting and warping in ways that didn't make sense. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. Tall and thin, its face obscured. But when I looked again, it was gone. By the time we stumbled back into the clearing, we were out of breath, our faces pale and drenched in sweat. The symbols on the trees seemed brighter now, their lines catching the faint light like they were glowing. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was even worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. "We're not getting out," Emily said finally, her voice breaking. "We're trapped." "No," Chris said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "We'll find a way. We just need to keep trying." But as I looked at the twisted trees and the endless loop of the forest, I couldn't help but wonder if she was right. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive, and it had us exactly where it wanted. The day began with a grim quiet. The events of the previous days had left us all shaken, and as we sat around the faint embers of last night's fire, the mood was heavy with unspoken fears. None of us knew how to break the silence. What could we say? We were lost in a forest that didn't make sense, haunted by whispers and shadows. And one of us was already gone. The thought of Tyler's disappearance hung over us like a storm cloud, and no one wanted to be the first to admit what we were all thinking, that he wasn't coming back. Emily had been unusually quiet that morning. She sat a little apart from the rest of us, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring out at the trees. At first I thought she was just tired. None of us had slept well, but there was something different about her silence. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something else. I caught her glancing over her shoulder more than once, her eyes darting to the shadows between the trees, like she was expecting to see something. Or someone. "Emily, you okay?" I asked. my voice breaking the uneasy stillness. She didn't respond right away. When she finally looked at me, her expression was distant, like she hadn't really heard the question. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. We all knew it. As we packed up what little gear we still had and prepared to set out again, Emily lingered behind, her eyes fixed on the forest. Chris had to call her name twice before she finally snapped out of whatever trance she was in and joined us. I noticed how she kept looking over her shoulder as we walked, her movements slow and distracted. It wasn't long before the whispers started again. They were faint at first, so faint that I wasn't sure if I was really hearing them or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But Emily froze in her tracks, her head tilting slightly, as though she were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Chris asked, glancing around nervously. Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the trees. Someone said my name." "No one said anything," Max said quickly, though his tone betrayed his unease. "You're just tired." "No," Emily insisted, her voice rising. "I heard it, clear as day. Someone said my name." "Emily, it's probably just the wind," Sarah said, trying to sound reassuring but failing miserably. "This place is messing with all of us." But Emily wasn't convinced. She kept turning her head, her eyes darting from one shadow to another. "It's not the wind," she said firmly. It was. It sounded like Tyler. That stopped all of us in our tracks. The mere mention of Tyler's name felt like a punch to the gut. We'd all been avoiding the subject, clinging to the fragile hope that maybe he was still out there, alive and waiting for us to find him. But the idea that he was calling out to Emily, here in this cursed forest, it didn't feel like hope. It felt like something dark. "Emily, that's not possible," Chris said gently, stepping toward her. He's gone." "You don't know that," Emily snapped, her voice shaking. "What if he's out there, lost and scared, and he's trying to find us? What if he needs our help?" "Emily," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "we've been looking for him. If he was out there, we would have found him by now." She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the trees, her eyes narrowing. "I can hear him," she whispered. "He's calling me." We exchanged uneasy glances, none of us sure what to say. The whispers were louder now, swirling around us like a cold wind, though I couldn't make out any words. They were just sounds. But Emily seemed certain. She stepped away from the group, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were following an invisible thread. "Emily, stop," Chris said, his voice firm. "Don't go out there." "I have to," she said, her voice distant. "He's waiting for me." "Emily, listen to me," Chris said, stepping in front of her. "It's not Tyler. Whatever you're hearing, it's not him. It's this place. It's trying to trick you." But Emily wasn't listening. She stepped around Chris, her gaze fixed on something just beyond the trees. "I can see him," she said, her voice breaking. "He's right there." "Ellie, there's nothing there," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Please, don't do this." But Emily didn't stop. She moved deeper into the woods, her pace quickening, her focus unshakable. We ran after her, calling her name, but it was like she couldn't even hear us. She was too far gone, too caught up in whatever illusion the forest had created for her. "Emily, stop," Chris shouted, grabbing her arm. She spun around, her eyes wild. "Let me go," she screamed, yanking her arm free. "I have to find him." "Emily, please," I begged, stepping closer. "You're scaring us. Just come back to the camp, and we'll figure this out together." But she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said. "He's here. I can feel him. I can hear him. He's calling me." And with that, she turned and ran. "Emily," Chris shouted, but she was already gone, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. We stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. Then, without a word, we all took off after her, crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we tried to keep her in sight. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping and chaotic, and I could swear I heard my own name among them. "Emily, stop," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Please." But Emily didn't stop. She was faster than we thought she could be, darting between the trees like she knew exactly where she was going. I tried to keep the camera steady, to capture anything, but the footage was a blur of trees and shadows. And then she was gone. We reached a small clearing, our breaths ragged and our hearts pounding, but Emily was nowhere to be seen. The forest around us was silent again, the whispers gone as if they'd never been there. "Where is she?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Where did she go?" Chris turned in a slow circle, shining his flashlight in every direction. "Emily," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Emily, answer me." But there was no response. "She's gone," Max said, his voice hollow, just like Tyler. "No," Chris said firmly. "We're not giving up. We'll find her." But as I looked around at the endless expanse of trees, I felt a sinking certainty in my chest. Emily wasn't coming back. The forest had taken her, just like it had taken Tyler, and we were next. The panic started the moment Sarah bolted after Emily. "Sarah, wait," Chris shouted, but she was already gone, disappearing into the dense forest. The sound of her footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. I stood there, clutching the camera, my heart racing as the others froze in shock. "What the hell is she doing?" Max yelled, throwing his hands up. "We just lost Emily, and now Sarah's running straight into this nightmare." "She's trying to help," Chris said, his tone sharp. "We can't just leave her out there." "Then what are we supposed to do?" Max shot back. "We don't even know where Emily went." "We go after them," Chris said, his voice firm. "We can't leave them out there alone." "Chris, they're gone." Max's voice cracked, the fear in his eyes betraying the bravado in his tone. "This forest, it takes people. You saw what happened to Tyler. Now Emily. Now Sarah. We can't keep. We're not leaving them." Chris shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. For a moment, no one said anything. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves above us, though it felt more like a whisper, a taunting. ghostly sound that made my skin crawl. "Fine," Max muttered, avoiding eye contact. "But when this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you." We grabbed what little we had, flashlights, a single bottle of water, and the camera, and headed in the direction Sarah had run. The trail she'd made was faint, almost non-existent, but Chris led the way, his flashlight sweeping the ground for any sign of her path. Every now and then we'd find something, a broken branch, a scuff in the dirt, but it always felt like the forest was erasing her trail behind her, making it harder and harder to follow. The whispers began soon after. At first they were faint, like the wind brushing through the trees, but as we moved deeper into the woods they grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words, at least, not in any language I recognized, but they carried an unmistakable intent. They weren't random. They were deliberate, directed at us, mocking us, luring us. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered at one point, her voice trembling. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around like she expected something to leap out from the shadows. "We all hear it," Chris said grimly. "Just keep moving." But it wasn't that simple. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere, circling us, growing louder the further we went. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were invading our thoughts, creeping into our minds like a parasite. I could feel them under my skin, in my chest, pressing down on my lungs. It was suffocating. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon the lake. It appeared suddenly, the trees giving way to a small, murky body of water that glistened faintly under the gray light filtering through the canopy. The sight of it should have been a relief, a break from the suffocating forest, but it wasn't. The lake felt wrong, like it didn't belong. The water was too still, too dark, as if it were hiding something beneath its surface. "Do you think they came this way?" Max asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Maybe," Chris said, scanning the shoreline with his flashlight. "Look for anything, footprints, clothes, anything." We spread out, keeping close to each other, but scanning the ground for any sign of Emily or Sarah. My heart was pounding, my hands slick with sweat as I held the camera. I kept glancing at the lake, half expecting to see something break the surface, a hand, a face, something that shouldn't be there. "Over here." Chris's voice shattered the silence, and we all rushed to where he was standing. He was holding something in his hands, a shoe, a single, mud-caked sneaker, Sarah's sneaker. "Oh God," Emily whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "Are you sure it's hers?" Max asked, though he didn't sound like he really wanted an answer. Chris nodded grimly. "It's hers. I remember seeing it earlier." "Where's the other one?" I asked, my voice trembling. Where's Sarah?" Chris didn't answer. None of us did. We just stood there, staring at the shoe like it might somehow explain what had happened. But it didn't. It couldn't. The whispers grew louder. They were deafening now, an endless cacophony that seemed to come from the very air around us. I could feel them in my bones, vibrating through me like the hum of some malevolent energy. My name was in there, I was sure of it, soft and drawn out, spoken in a voice that wasn't human. I looked around, desperate to see who or what was speaking, but there was nothing. Just the trees, looming and silent. "We need to leave," Max said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "Now." But Emily started, but Max cut her off. "She's gone, Emily. Just like Tyler, just like Emily. We can't save them." "Shut up," Chris snapped, his voice harsh. "We don't know that. We keep looking." "Keep looking where?" Max shot back. "The forest isn't going to let us find them. You know it. I know it. "They're gone, Chris. And if we don't get out of here, we'll be next." Chris looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he dropped his shoe and turned away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For the first time, he looked broken. We started back toward the campsite, moving quickly, our flashlights cutting through the gathering gloom. The whispers followed us, growing louder and louder until they were almost unbearable. I kept the camera rolling, though I didn't know why. Maybe I thought it would protect me, or maybe I just needed to believe that someone, somewhere, would see what had happened to us. When we finally stumbled back into the clearing, the fire pit was cold, the tents dark and empty. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the silence of a predator, waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Sarah was gone. Emily was gone. Tyler was gone. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the forest came for the rest of us. The lake sat still and dark, its surface like a black mirror reflecting the overcast sky. It shouldn't have felt threatening, just a body of water surrounded by trees, but it did. There was something about the way it refused to ripple, even when the wind swept across its surface. Something about the smell, faintly metallic, that carried a sickly sweetness. The air around it was colder, denser, like the lake itself was drawing the heat and energy out of everything nearby. We stood at the shoreline, staring at the water. No one spoke. The atmosphere was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses down on you until you feel like you're going to scream just to break it. I kept the camera trained on the lake, its lens zooming in and out as if it might reveal something we couldn't see with our own eyes. But there was nothing, just endless, motionless water. "This place," Max muttered under his breath, pacing back and forth along the shore. His voice was strained, tinged with desperation. "There has to be something here. Something that explains all of this." "Max, stop," Chris said sharply. "We need to think this through." "Think what through?" Max snapped, spinning to face him. "What's there to think about? Tyler's gone, Emily's gone, Sarah's gone. And now we're standing here like idiots, waiting for the forest to decide who it's going to take next." "Shouting isn't going to help," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We need to stay calm." "Calm?" Max laughed bitterly. "You want me to stay calm? We're trapped in some kind of nightmare forest, people are disappearing, and you want me to stay calm?" "Max," Chris said, stepping forward, "we're all scared, okay? But we're not going to find answers by..." Max cut him off. "You know what? Screw this." He dropped his flashlight and stormed toward the water, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. "If there's something in this lake, I'm going to find it." "Max, don't," I said, lowering the camera for a moment. "We don't know what's in there." "Exactly," Max said, kicking off his boots. "And maybe it's time we found out." Before any of us could stop him, Max waded into the lake. The water was so dark it swallowed his legs almost immediately, making it look like he was walking into a void. He didn't hesitate, didn't look back. He just kept going, the water rising to his knees, his waist, his chest. "Max, stop," Chris shouted, moving toward the shore. "You don't know what's in there." But Max ignored him. With one deep breath, he dove under, disappearing beneath the surface. The lake swallowed him whole, its surface rippling slightly before settling back into perfect stillness. We stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where he'd gone under. Seconds passed, then a minute. The longer he was down, the heavier the silence became. My grip on the camera tightened, the lens still trained on the lake, waiting for any sign of movement. "Max," Emily called out, her voice breaking. "Max, come back." The water remained still. "Jesus," Chris muttered, running a hand through his hair. "What the hell is he doing?" Then, finally, the surface broke. Max emerged, gasping for air, his arms flailing as he fought to stay afloat. But he wasn't empty-handed. In one hand he clutched something large and rusted, its edges jagged and corroded. It took me a moment to realize what it was: a car door. What the Chris started, but his words trailed off as we rushed to help Max back to shore. He staggered out of the water, dripping and shivering, the car door dragging behind him. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing onto the muddy bank. "It's down there. A car. There's a car in the lake." "A car," Emily echoed, her voice filled with confusion and dread. "What are you talking about?" Max dropped the car door on the ground with a heavy thud. "It's buried," he said between ragged breaths. "Completely submerged. I saw it when I was down there." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Max said, sitting up and wiping the water from his face. "But I wasn't imagining it. There's a car down there." Chris knelt beside the car door, his flashlight sweeping over it. It was heavily rusted, the paint peeling away to reveal patches of corroded metal. But it wasn't just the state of the door that unsettled me, it was what was inside. Wedged into the small pocket of the door's interior were bones. Small ones. Animal bones, maybe, but the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. "There's more," Max said, his voice quieter now, as though he were afraid to say it out loud. "Inside the car, there were backpacks, clothes, bones." "Bones," Emily repeated, her face pale. Max nodded. "It's like the car's been there for years, decades maybe. But the stuff inside, it looked newer, like someone had been adding to it." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. I tried to process what he was saying, but my mind was spinning. A car buried in the lake, filled with bones and camping gear. It didn't make sense, none of this made sense. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave now." "We can't," Chris said, his tone grim. "We've been trying to leave for days, remember? The forest won't let us." Emily turned to him, her eyes wide and desperate. "Then what do we do? Just sit here and wait for it to take the rest of us?" "No," Max said firmly, his hands clenched into fists. "We fight back. Whatever's happening here, whatever's controlling this place, it's not invincible. If that car's part of it, then maybe we can destroy it." Chris hesitated, glancing at the car door. "You really think that'll work?" "I don't know," Max admitted, "but it's better than doing nothing." The group fell silent, each of us staring at the lake, the still black water reflecting the twisted branches of the trees above. The whispers had started again, faint and distant, but growing louder with every passing second. They seemed to be mocking us, taunting us, daring us to try and fight back. I kept the camera rolling, the lens capturing every detail: the rusted car door, the fear etched into my friends' faces, the dark water lapping at the shore. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but deep down I felt it in my bones, whatever this lake was hiding. It was just the beginning. And we were running out of time. The forest seemed to funnel us toward it. For hours we wandered, every trail, every makeshift path bending and weaving, until we stood before the heart of the nightmare, the whispering tree. It loomed above us, ancient and grotesque, its massive trunk twisted and gnarled like the clenched fist of some vengeful god. The bark was blackened and scarred, as though it had survived countless fires, yet it stood unyielding, defiant against time and decay. It wasn't just its size that made it terrifying, it was the names. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them, carved into the bark with a precision that seemed impossible. Some were old, so faded they were barely legible, while others were fresh. The wounds in the wood still raw and oozing sap that looked disturbingly like blood. The air around the tree was heavy, thick with the smell of rot and earth. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do. The whispers, which had followed us relentlessly, were louder here, more distinct. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, layered and overlapping, spoken in tones that ranged from pleading to mocking to enraged. "What is this?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at the tree in horrified fascination. "The heart of it," Chris said grimly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "This is where it all comes from." Max stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating more of the tree's monstrous surface. "Look at the names," he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of awe and dread. "They're all names, people's names." "Tyler," Emily said suddenly, her breath hitching. She pointed to a spot near the base of the tree, where his name was carved in jagged letters. "Oh my God, Tyler's name is here." We crowded around, our flashlights converging on the same spot. Sure enough, there it was, Tyler Andrews, etched deep into the bark. The letters looked fresh, as though they'd been carved only hours ago. "This isn't possible," Sarah said, shaking her head. How could his name be here?" "It's not just his," Max said, shining his flashlight higher. "Look." We followed the beam, our stomachs sinking as we saw more names we recognized. Emily Ward, Sarah Miller, Chris Taylor, Max Carter, my own name Jason Green. They were all there, scattered among the thousands of others, some higher up, some lower, but all unmistakably ours. "What does this mean?" Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why are our names here?" "It means the forest knows us," Chris said, his voice hollow. "It's marked us." "Marked us for what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Max didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer to the tree, his flashlight casting long shadows across its grotesque surface. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the bark. "Max, don't," Chris said sharply. "We don't know what this thing is." But Max ignored him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the tree, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sudden, deliberate motion, he pulled a pocket knife from his jacket and opened it. "Max, what are you doing?" Emily asked, her voice rising in panic. "I want to see what happens," he said simply, his tone eerily calm. "No," Emily shouted, lunging toward him, but Chris held her back. "Max, don't do this." But Max was already carving. The blade of his knife bit into the bark with a sickening sound, peeling away the blackened wood to reveal fresh, pale flesh beneath. He worked quickly, his movements precise, as though he were compelled by some unseen force. Within seconds, his name was there, stark and glaring against the twisted surface of the tree: Max Carter. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest was silent, the whispers seemingly gone. Max stepped back, admiring his work with a grim smile. "See," he said, turning to face us. "Nothing to." The screams cut him off. They weren't just sounds, they were a violent, overwhelming force, slamming into us like a physical blow. I dropped the camera, clamping my hands over my ears as the noise filled every inch of my being. It wasn't just one scream, it was hundreds, thousands, all layered on top of each other, rising and falling in an unbearable cacophony. Max staggered back, his hands flying to his ears. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. The tree began to change. The names on its surface started to glow, a sickly, pulsating light that seemed to come from within. The bark shifted and twisted, the scars and carvings moving as though the tree were alive. The ground beneath us trembled, and the air grew colder, each breath freezing in our lungs. "Run!" Chris shouted, grabbing Emily and pulling her away. "We need to get out of here." But Max didn't move. He was frozen in place, staring at the tree as though he were in a trance. I can hear them," he said, his voice trembling. "The voices. They're saying my name." "Max, get away from it," Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Please." But he didn't. Instead, he reached out again, his hand trembling as he touched the bark. The glow intensified, the screams rising to a deafening crescendo. The ground beneath Max's feet cracked and split, and before any of us could react, the roots of the tree shot up, wrapping around his legs like serpents. "Max!" Chris shouted, rushing forward, but the ground split further, a jagged chasm opening between us and Max. We could only watch, helpless, as the roots pulled him closer to the tree. "Help me!" Max screamed, his voice filled with terror. "Don't let it take me." We tried to reach him, but the chasm was too wide, the tree's roots writhing and lashing out like living things. Max's screams were swallowed by the forest, his body pulled into the trunk of the tree as though it were devouring him. The glow faded, the bark sealing shut as if nothing had happened. The whispers returned, soft and mocking. We stood there, staring at the tree in stunned silence. Max was gone. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed Tyler, Emily, and Sarah. And we knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't done with us yet. The forest had grown darker, as if the very air around us was absorbing the light. Even with our flashlights, the shadows seemed deeper, denser, almost alive. After Max disappeared into the tree, none of us could think straight. The sounds of his screams still echoed in my mind, blending with the ever-present whispers that seemed to crawl under my skin. None of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the massive tree, its surface now eerily still, as though it hadn't just swallowed one of us whole. Chris was the first to break the silence. "We have to leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." "Leave?" Emily snapped, her face pale and streaked with tears. "How? We've been trying to leave for days. The forest won't let us." "We can't just stay here," Chris said firmly, though even he sounded uncertain. "We have to do something." I kept the camera rolling out of habit, my hands trembling as I tried to focus the lens on the tree. The names carved into its bark were no longer glowing, but they seemed different. New names had appeared, names I didn't recognize, but ours were still there, glaring and fresh. I zoomed in on Max's name, carved so neatly into the bark, now a grim reminder of what had just happened. Then Emily noticed it. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the base of the tree. Her flashlight beam illuminated a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there recently. "Is that a grave?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Chris didn't answer. He walked toward the spot, his movements hesitant, as though the ground itself might swallow him whole. He knelt and began brushing away the dirt with his hands, revealing more of the uneven mound. The whispers seemed to grow louder as he worked. though I couldn't tell if they were coming from the forest or from inside my own head. "Help me," Chris said, looking up at the rest of us. None of us moved at first, but then Emily stepped forward, dropping to her knees beside him. I followed, setting the camera down but keeping it aimed at the scene. Together, we dug with our hands, the cold, damp earth clinging to our skin. The more we dug, the louder the whispers became, until they were almost deafening. And then we found it. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn, stained dark with what I could only hope was mud. Chris pulled it out of the earth with shaking hands, holding it up as though it were some cursed artifact. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air around us felt heavier, colder, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Open it," Emily whispered. Chris hesitated, then slowly flipped it open. The pages were damp and yellowed, the ink smudged in places, but it was still legible. He skimmed the first few entries, his brow furrowing as he read. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Chris glanced at me, then back at the journal. It's someone's account. Someone who was here before us." "Someone else was trapped here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Chris nodded. "They talk about the whispers, the tree, the forest, everything we've been experiencing. They were trying to find a way out." "Did they find one?" Emily asked urgently, leaning closer. Chris didn't answer right away. He flipped to the last few pages, his eyes scanning the text. Then he froze, his face going pale. "What?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What does it say?" Chris swallowed hard and began reading aloud. "There is a way to escape. The forest, it feeds on us, on our fear, on our lives. But it has a weakness, a sacrifice. One must stay behind willingly, and the forest will let the others go." The silence that followed was suffocating. None of us could look at each other. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment the only sound was the faint rustling of the trees and the ever-present whispers. "That's it," Emily said finally, her voice breaking. "That's the only way. One of us has to stay behind." Chris nodded slowly, closing the journal. "That's what it says." "That's insane," Max said, shaking his head. We're not doing that. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Chris said, his voice low. "You've seen what this place can do. It won't let us leave unless we follow its rules." Emily stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth. "This can't be happening. This isn't real. None of this is real." "It's real," Sarah said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "We all know it is." I picked up the camera, aiming it at Chris as he stared down at the journal. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of resolve, or maybe madness. When he finally looked up, his gaze was different, harder. "I'll do it," he said. "What?" Emily froze, turning to face him. No, Chris, you can't." "Someone has to," Chris said firmly, standing up. "We can't all stay here. If this is the only way, then I'll do it." "No," Emily shouted, grabbing his arm. "We'll find another way. We have to." "There is no other way," Chris snapped, pulling free. "Do you think I want to do this? Or do you think I want to die here? I don't. But if it means the rest of you can get out, then it's worth it." The group erupted into chaos, everyone shouting at once. Emily was crying, begging Chris to reconsider. Sarah was shaking her head, muttering, "This isn't right. This isn't right." And Max just stood there, staring at the tree with a strange expression on his face, like he was considering something. It wasn't until Chris started walking toward the tree that I realized what was happening. He was holding the journal tightly in one hand, his flashlight in the other. The whispers grew louder with each step he took, rising to a fever pitch as he approached the monstrous trunk. "Chris, stop!" Emily screamed, running after him. "You don't have to do this." But Chris didn't stop. He turned to face us, his expression calm but resolute. "Take the journal," he said, handing it to Emily. "Get out of here. Don't look back." "Chris, please," Emily sobbed, clutching the journal to her chest. "Please don't do this." Chris smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with tears. "It's okay," he said. "It's going to be okay." And then he turned back to the tree. The whispers became screams as he reached out and touched the bark. The ground trembled, the air around us crackling with energy. The tree seemed to pulse, its twisted surface glowing faintly as it accepted him. Roots shot up from the ground, wrapping around his legs and pulling him closer. "Chris," Emily screamed, but it was too late. The tree claimed him, just as it had claimed Max. The glow faded, the screams died down, and the forest went silent once more. We stood there, too stunned to move, too horrified to speak. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an eerie, almost peaceful quiet. The forest felt different, lighter, somehow, as though it had been sated. And then, as if on cue, a path opened before us, the trees parting to reveal the way out. Chris had kept his word. He had saved us. And we left, the weight of his sacrifice hanging heavy over us, knowing that the forest would always have a part of us, and that we would never, ever be the same. The tension had been simmering for hours, but I don't think any of us really believed it would come to this. We were already on edge, our nerves frayed from days of fear, exhaustion, and loss. The forest had chipped away at us, piece by piece, until we were shadows of ourselves, worn down and raw. But when Max turned on us, when his fear and desperation finally boiled over, it felt like the final crack in what little remained of our sanity. It started with an argument, one of the many we'd had since realizing we were trapped. We were back in the clearing near the whispering tree, our flashlights casting shaky beams of light that barely pierced the oppressive darkness. The journal Chris had found was open on the ground between us, its pages illuminated by the weak glow. The words were still fresh in our minds. A sacrifice must be made. "Why are we even debating this?" Max said, pacing back and forth, his voice rising with every word. "We know what we have to do. The journal's clear. Someone stays, the rest of us go. That's the deal. All..." "No," Chris said firmly, stepping between Max and the others. "We're not doing this. There has to be another way." "Another way?" Max laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "How long are we going to keep telling ourselves that? How many more of us have to disappear before we face reality? Tyler's gone. Emily's gone. Sarah's gone. And you still think we're gonna find some magical exit?" Chris didn't answer. He just stared at Max, his jaw clenched, his flashlight steady in his hand. Max stopped pacing and pointed at the tree. "That thing has been playing with us since we got here. It's not going to stop until we do what it wants. So, yeah, maybe it's time we stop pretending we're better than this." "What are you saying?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. She was standing a few feet behind Chris, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Max turned to her, his expression hard. I'm saying it's you." "What?" Emily's voice broke, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You heard me," Max said, stepping closer. "You're the one it wants. It always goes for the ones who are scared, the ones who are vulnerable. You've been hearing things, seeing things. It's been calling you, hasn't it?" "Max, stop," Chris said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Max shot back. "And so do you. If we don't give it what it wants, we're all going to die here. So yeah, I'm making the call. Emily stays." "You're insane," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "You can't do this." "Max, you're not thinking straight," Chris said, stepping forward. "Put the knife down." It wasn't until that moment that I noticed the blade in Max's hand. It was small, just a pocket knife, but the sight of it sent a jolt of fear through me. He must have grabbed it earlier, when we weren't paying attention. Now he held it tightly, his knuckles white. "I'm doing what needs to be done," Max said, his voice unsteady. "If none of you have the guts to make the hard choice, I will." "Max, this isn't you," Chris said, his voice calm but firm. "The forest is messing with your head. Put the knife down, and we'll figure this out together." "Oh, don't patronize me," Max snapped. "I see it in your eyes, Chris. You know I'm right. You're just too much of a coward to admit it." "Back off, Max," Chris said, his tone sharp now. "I'm warning you." But Max didn't back off. He took a step toward Emily, and that was when all hell broke loose. Chris moved first, lunging at Max and grabbing his wrist. The two of them grappled, their flashlights tumbling to the ground as they fought. The knife glinted in the faint light, its blade catching the shadows as they struggled. Max was stronger than I realized, but Chris held his ground. His teeth clenched as he tried to wrestle the knife away. "Stop it," Emily screamed, but neither of them listened. I don't know why I didn't intervene. Maybe it was fear, or maybe I was frozen by the sheer horror of what was happening. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I kept filming. The camera's lens was steady, capturing every movement, every shout, every glint of the knife as the two of them fought. Max managed to push Chris back, sending him stumbling into a tree. He turned to Emily, his eyes wild, the knife raised. "I'm sorry," he said, though his voice lacked any real remorse. "It's the only way." "No," Emily screamed, backing away, her hands raised in defense. Chris recovered quickly, tackling Max before he could get any closer. The two of them hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt as they fought for control of the knife. Max was shouting now, his voice raw with desperation. "You don't get it. It's her, or all of us. You think the forest is just going to let us walk out of here?" "You don't know that," Chris shouted back, his fist pounding against Max's arms as he tried to disarm him. "We don't kill each other. That's not who we are." "Then we all die," Max yelled, his voice breaking. The knife flashed again, its blade slicing through the air as Max swung wildly. Chris dodged, barely missing the blade, and managed to pin Max's arm to the ground. With a grunt of effort, he pried the knife from Max's hand and threw it into the bushes. For a moment, everything was still. Chris sat on top of Max, breathing heavily, his fists clenched as he stared down at him. Max didn't move, his chest rising and falling as he glared up at Chris with wide, furious eyes. "Are you done?" Chris asked, his voice low and cold. Max didn't respond. He just looked away, his expression hardening into something unreadable. Chris stood up slowly, pulling Max to his feet and shoving him toward the others. "We're not doing this," he said firmly, his voice shaking with anger. "I don't care what the journal says. We don't sacrifice people. We don't turn on each other. Not here. Not ever." Max didn't say anything. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. Emily was sobbing, her hands pressed to her face as Sarah tried to comfort her. I kept the camera trained on them, the lens capturing every moment, every raw emotion, every shattered piece of what we once were.
The forest was silent again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the silence of something watching, waiting, enjoying the chaos it had sown. I don't know why I kept filming. Maybe I thought someone had to see this, someone had to know what happened here. Or maybe I just needed the camera to remind me that this was real, that we were still here, still alive, still fighting. But deep down, I knew the forest wasn't done with us yet.
It was desperation, pure and simple. By the time we decided to burn the tree, we were barely holding on physically, mentally, emotionally. The forest had taken everything from us. Tyler, Emily, Sarah, and Max were gone. The whispers had driven us to the brink of madness. Every attempt to escape had brought us back to the same cursed clearing, to the same massive, gnarled tree with its grotesque carvings and endless, mocking names. Chris was the one who suggested it. "We burn it," he said, his voice low and steady, though his eyes betrayed the sheer exhaustion behind them. "We burn the tree and end this." "Do you think it'll work?" I asked, my voice shaking as I clutched the camera like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. "Do you have a better idea?" he shot back. He had a point. We were out of options, and the forest wasn't going to let us leave unless we fought back. I didn't know if it would work, but it felt like we had to try. It was the only thing we had left, the tiniest sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could destroy the thing that had trapped us here. Chris and I scavenged what we could from our remaining supplies. We found a nearly empty bottle of lighter fluid in one of the backpacks, along with a pack of matches that, miraculously, wasn't completely soaked from the endless dampness of the forest. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The tree loomed over us as we approached it, its blackened bark seeming to absorb the light from our flashlights. The names carved into its surface seemed even more vivid now, almost glowing in the darkness. I couldn't stop myself from staring at them, at my own name, etched so deeply into the wood, as though it had always been there. I felt sick just looking at it. Chris didn't hesitate. He stepped up to the base of the tree, uncapped the lighter fluid, and began dousing the roots and lower trunk. The liquid glistened in the flashlight beam, trickling down the twisted wood like oil. The whispers started again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as Chris worked, they grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words, voices, overlapping and chaotic, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "Hurry," I said, my voice barely audible over the rising whispers. "I'm almost done," Chris replied, his hands steady as he emptied the last of the lighter fluid onto the tree. He stepped back, tossing the empty bottle aside, and pulled out the matches. The whispers grew deafening as he struck the first match. The tiny flame flickered in the damp air, casting eerie shadows across his face. He hesitated for just a moment, his eyes fixed on the tree, before stepping forward and touching the flame to the bark. Nothing happened. The match burned out almost instantly, the flames snuffed by the cold, damp wood. Chris cursed under his breath and struck another match, trying again, and again, and again. Each time the result was the same. The tree refused to burn. "It's not working," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Why isn't it working?" "Try the roots," I said, desperation creeping into my tone. Maybe they'll catch. Chris nodded and struck another match, kneeling to hold the flame against the roots. For a moment it seemed like it might work. The flame flickered, licking at the lighter fluid, but then it sputtered out, leaving only a faint trail of smoke. The whispers became screams. They came from everywhere and nowhere, a relentless assault of sound that felt like it was drilling into my skull. I dropped the camera, clapping my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head now, filling every corner of my mind with their guttural, inhuman tones.
Stop, I screamed, though I wasn't sure who I was yelling at: the forest, the tree, the voices, or myself. Just stop.
Chris staggered back from the tree, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He was shouting something, but I couldn't hear him over the screams. The ground beneath us trembled, and I could feel the vibrations through my boots, as though the forest itself was alive and furious. The tree began to change. The names on its surface glowed brighter, the light pulsating in time with the screams. The bark shifted and twisted, the carvings seeming to writhe like living things. The air around us grew colder, and a foul, metallic smell filled my nostrils, making me gag. "We have to go," Chris shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away. But I started to protest, but he cut me off. "Now," he yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. I didn't argue. I grabbed the camera and followed him, stumbling over roots and uneven ground as we fled the clearing. The screams followed us, echoing through the forest, growing louder with every step. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like claws, scratching at our faces and clothes. I don't know how long we ran. Time had lost all meaning in that place, and every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into the nightmare. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Not until we were sure we were far enough away. Eventually we collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for air. The screams had faded, replaced by the ever-present whispers, which now felt almost soothing in comparison. Chris sat beside me, his head in his hands, his entire body trembling. "It didn't work," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't work." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? The tree had won. The forest had won. And we were still trapped. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, too exhausted and broken to move. The camera lay forgotten at my side, its lens pointed up at the canopy above, capturing the faint glimmers of light that managed to break through the darkness. I don't know how we made it out. One moment we were in the depths of the forest, surrounded by shadows and whispers. The next, we were stumbling out into the pale light of dawn, the edge of the forest behind us. The transition was so abrupt, so surreal, that it felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into another world. But even as we stood there, breathing in the fresh, open air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with us, that it was still watching, still waiting, still hungry.
We had escaped. But not really, not entirely. Because no matter how far we ran, how long we stayed away, the forest would always be with us.
And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it called us back. I don't know how I made it out. I don't even remember most of it. All I know is that I ran. I ran harder and faster than I've ever run in my life. My legs burned, my chest ached, and my lungs screamed for air. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The forest was alive behind me, moving, shifting, chasing. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, guttural and deafening, reverberating through the trees like the roar of an angry beast. It didn't feel like I was running toward anything. I wasn't following a trail or looking for landmarks. I just ran, letting instinct take over, hoping against hope that my legs would carry me to safety. The camera bounced in my hand as I sprinted, its strap cutting into my palm. I don't even know why I held on to it. Maybe I thought it was the only proof I had of what happened. Maybe I thought it would protect me like some kind of talisman. Or maybe I was just too afraid to let it go. The forest seemed endless, its twisted trees reaching out like claws, their branches scraping at my face and arms. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, figures darting between the trees, too fast and too indistinct to make out. Were they the others? Were they something else? I didn't know, and I didn't dare stop to find out. Chris, I screamed at one point, my voice raw and broken. Emily, Sarah. No answer. Just the forest, its silence more suffocating than any response could have been. I tripped more than once, my feet catching on roots and rocks hidden beneath the undergrowth. Each time I hit the ground hard, the impact jolting through my body and knocking the wind out of me. But I didn't stay down. I scrambled back to my feet, ignoring the pain, and kept running. The fear was too great, too all-encompassing to let me rest. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding me, closing in. They weren't just in the air, they were in my head, crawling through my thoughts, overlapping and chaotic. They spoke my name over and over, in voices that ranged from soft and pleading to sharp and accusing. Jason, Jason, Jason. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me, echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind. I could feel them, like a weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. At some point, I realized the forest was changing. The trees were thinning, their branches less tangled, their shadows less oppressive. The whispers were quieter, too, fading into the background like the dying embers of a fire. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I didn't trust it. Not yet. And then I saw it. The edge of the forest. It appeared so suddenly, so abruptly, that I almost didn't believe it was real. The dense canopy above gave way to open sky, and the oppressive darkness was replaced by the pale, golden light of dawn. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The whispers stopped entirely as I crossed the threshold, stepping out of the woods and into open space. I collapsed onto the ground, my knees hitting the dirt with a thud. The camera slipped from my hand, landing awkwardly beside me, its lens cracked and smudged. I didn't care. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but lie there, staring up at the sky as the weight of the past few days crashed down on me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, sprawled on the ground just outside the forest. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. My body was heavy, my mind numb, and all I could do was breathe. Each breath felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was still alive, that I had made it out. But I wasn't whole. Not really. I turned my head slightly, my gaze falling on the camera. It was still recording, the tiny red light blinking steadily. Without thinking, I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The screen flickered as I pressed play, the footage skipping and stuttering. What it showed made my stomach twist. The last thing the camera had recorded before I collapsed near the edge of the forest was me, running. My face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, my eyes wide with terror. Behind me, the forest was alive, its trees shifting and writhing as though trying to reach for me. And then, in the shadows, just before the footage cut out, I saw them. The others. They were there, standing among the trees, their faces blank and expressionless. Tyler, Emily, Sarah, Max, they weren't moving, weren't speaking, just watching. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, their bodies barely visible against the twisted backdrop of the forest. And then the screen went black. I dropped the camera, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, staring at the edge of the forest, the memory of their faces burned into my mind. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they're still in there, trapped like ghosts, or if the forest consumed them entirely. I don't even know why it let me go. Maybe it wanted me to tell the story. Maybe it wanted me to carry its darkness with me, to spread it like a virus. Or maybe it just wasn't done with me yet. I made it out of the forest, but a part of me is still there, lost among the whispers and shadows, trapped with the others. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much time passes, I know one thing for sure. The forest will always find me. The forest felt like a distant nightmare, but it never truly left me. Even after I made it out, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I didn't talk about what happened, not to anyone. Who would believe me? The things I'd seen, the things I'd heard, they didn't belong to this world. They belonged to the forest, to that cursed, living maze that had claimed my friends. The camera was the only thing I brought back with me, a small, broken piece of the nightmare I'd escaped. It sat in the corner of my room for weeks, untouched, its cracked lens staring at me like an unblinking eye. I couldn't bring myself to watch the footage. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would show. I had lived it, and I wasn't sure I could survive reliving it. But then the camera disappeared. I don't know how it happened. One day it was there, sitting on my desk, and the next it was gone. At first I thought I'd misplaced it, that maybe I'd moved it without thinking. But deep down I knew the truth. The forest wasn't done with me. It never would be. I didn't hear about the hiker until weeks later. It was a small story, buried in the back pages of the local newspaper. Lost hiker finds camera near Whispering Pines. There wasn't much detail, just a brief mention that the camera had been found at the edge of the forest, its memory card still intact. The article said the hiker had turned it over to the authorities, who were investigating its contents. I didn't sleep that night. The thought of strangers watching what the camera had recorded, seeing the things we'd seen, hearing the whispers, reliving the terror made my skin crawl. It wasn't just that I was afraid of what they'd find. It was that I already knew. The phone call came a few days later. It was someone from the local ranger's office, their voice calm but tinged with unease. They told me they'd reviewed the footage, that they'd seen what had happened to us. They didn't ask me any questions they didn't need to. The tone of their voice said it all. They believed me, or at least they believed the camera. But there was something else, something they didn't know how to explain. The last clip, the ranger said, pausing as though searching for the right words. The last thing the camera recorded, it shows a figure approaching the lens. I felt the blood drain from my face. What kind of figure? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We're not sure, they admitted. It's blurry, distorted, but it looks human. Almost. Almost, I echoed, my stomach twisting. The ranger hesitated again, and I could hear the faint rustle of papers in the background, as though they were reading from a report. It's hard to describe. The figure moves toward the camera, but the way it moves, it's not natural. And just before the clip ends, the figure stops, right in front of the lens. I didn't ask what happened next. I didn't need to. I could already see it in my mind, the blank, glowing eyes, the twisted shapes in the shadows, the whispers growing louder until they were all I could hear. The ranger asked if I wanted to come in and review the footage to confirm what they'd seen. I told them no. I didn't need to see it. I already knew what was on that tape. I had lived it, and I couldn't live it again. The camera was never returned to me. I don't know what the authorities did with it, and I don't care. Let them keep it. Let them try to make sense of it. I wanted no part of it anymore. As for me, I left town not long after. I couldn't stay. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window, every faint whisper of wind brought me back to that place, to the forest that had almost swallowed me whole. I moved halfway across the country, to a place where the trees were sparse and the land was open and bright. But even here, the forest haunts me. In my dreams, I see its twisted branches, its shifting shadows. I hear its whispers, soft and insistent, calling my name. I don't know why the forest let me go. Maybe it wanted me to tell the story. Maybe it wanted me to carry its darkness with me, to spread its terror to anyone who would listen. Or maybe it just wanted me to live with the knowledge that I escaped when the others didn't, that I survived, but only by leaving a part of myself behind. The nightmares haven't stopped. They never will. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear something faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper carried on the wind, calling me back. I'll never go back to that forest. I'll never step foot in those cursed woods again. But I know, deep down, that it doesn't matter. The forest will find me. It always does.